The processor gave them 71 hours. After that, 411 people would have 9 days of stored air and no way to make more. The plant said it in the same flat synthesized voice it used for shift changes, and then it repeated the figure every hour on the hour so that nobody on Ashgrove could pretend they had not heard. Thomas Vey heard it standing in a stairwell with a cleaning cart, and his first thought was not fear. His first thought was that Ilse Brandt had been dead for 2 years, and there was nobody left who could do the repair. Ashgrove had one atmosphere plant, and it had been built by people who assumed a colony would grow into it. The colony had not grown. What it had instead was a single chief engineer who had held the whole thing in her head, and a training program she had designed to replace herself, which ran 6 years and had produced, in the end, nobody at all. 4 candidates had started it. 2 had left the colony. 1 had failed out in the 2nd year, and that one was standing in a stairwell holding a mop. The 4th had been halfway through year 5 when Ilse died, and had walked away from the program within the month, and now ran the colony's water board and did not discuss it. Thomas went up to the plant because everyone went up to the plant. 400 people stood on the gantries and looked at a machine none of them understood, and the voice said, 70 hours. And somebody at the back started to cry, and Thomas found he was thinking about a question Ilse had asked him in his 2nd year that he had never been able to answer. The question had got him thrown out of the program, more or less. She had put a schematic in front of him and asked him what order he would learn it in, and he had given the obvious answer, start at the intake, follow the flow, finish at the stacks, and she had told him that was wrong and would not say why. He had argued. He had been 23, and he had argued for an hour, and at the end of it she had said, quite kindly, that he was not going to be an engineer, and that she thought he already knew that. He had spent 11 years being angry about that afternoon. Standing on the gantry with the countdown running, Thomas found he was not thinking about the anger. He was thinking about the order. Because Ilse's curriculum had been strange, and everyone who touched it had said so. It did not follow the machine. It jumped, a week on the exchanger seals, then a fortnight on something in the scrubber stack that had nothing to do with seals, then back. The 2 candidates who left the colony had both complained about it in their exit interviews. It made no sense as a way to build understanding, and Ilse Brandt had been the most rigorous person any of them had ever met, and she had never once explained it, and she had refused every request to reorder it. Thomas went down to the plant office that night and asked the administrator for the curriculum files. The administrator asked why. Thomas said he wanted to know what she had been thinking, and the administrator, who had 69 hours left and nothing better to offer anyone, gave him everything. There were 406 lessons. He laid them out on the office floor, 1 card per lesson, and by 3 in the morning he had covered the whole floor and most of the corridor, and he was on his knees in the middle of it with the countdown going in the background. The lessons were not sequenced by system. They were not sequenced by difficulty either, which had been the other theory. Thomas crawled through them for 4 hours looking for the pattern and did not find it, and then he stopped looking for a pattern and did the thing that had got him thrown out. He asked what the arrangement was for. And when he asked that, he saw it in under a minute and had to sit down on the floor with his back against a filing cabinet. Every lesson was self-contained, not mostly, completely. Each one named its own inputs, its own outputs, its own tools, and its own single physical action, and not one of them required you to have done any of the others. She had written 6 years of engineering as 406 pieces that did not touch. You could hand any card to any person, and they could do the thing on it without understanding the machine at all. It was the least efficient way imaginable to train one engineer. It was a spectacularly good way to divide a job among 400 strangers who had 71 hours and no expertise whatsoever. Thomas sat on the floor of the plant office with his hands over his mouth. She had known. She had built it for this, and she had never told anyone. And he had spent 11 years thinking she had failed him. He took it to the administrator at 6 in the morning and was told, gently, that it was not going to happen. The objection was not stupid. It was, in fact, the correct objection, and Thomas had no answer to it. The repair needed to be right. 400 amateurs each performing one action they did not understand in sequence on a machine that could kill them and would certainly kill the colony if it went wrong. The failure modes were not small. One person doing a step out of order, one person mishearing an instruction, one person deciding in the moment that the card was mistaken and that they knew better. The administrator said, if a trained engineer makes an error, they notice because they understand what should have happened. Your 400 will not notice anything. And she was right. Tomas went back up to the plant with 62 hours left and stood on the gantry and worked it, because the alternative was to sit down and wait. He knew the objection was right. He also knew with a certainty he could not justify that Ilse Brandt had known it too, because she had thought about this longer than anyone, and she had not been careless once in her life. So the answer was, in the cards. He went back down and started going through them again, all 406. Not for the sequence this time, but for what each one told you to do when you were finished. And on card 11 he found it, and then he found it on card 12, and on every card after that, and it changed everything. What is at stake is 400 people and 9 days of air. And the only plan anyone has is a dead woman's filing system. Tomas wrote that at the top of the whiteboard because he needed the room to hold it in their heads. Then he explained what was on the cards. Every lesson ended with a check. Not a test of knowledge, a physical, observable check phrased for someone who understood nothing. Card 11 did not say, confirm the seal is correctly seated. It said, run your thumb around the join. If you feel a ridge anywhere, you are not finished. Card 31 said, the gauge should sit between the two scratches. There were scratches on the gauge. Ilse had put them there. Card 204 said, it will hiss for about the length of a slow breath and then stop. If it does not stop, close the valve you just opened and call for the next card. 406 lessons, everyone ending in something a frightened person with no training could see or hear or feel with their hands. She had not been teaching them to understand the machine. She had been teaching the machine to tell them when they were wrong. The room was very quiet. The administrator said after a while that it was still 400 points of failure. Tomas said yes. He said it was 400 points of failure, each of which announced itself immediately to the person standing in front of it, and that this was not the same thing at all, and that they had 58 hours, and that he would like to start now. They started at noon. Tomas did not run it. He had failed out in year 2, and everybody knew it, and he had the sense to see that his authority would not survive the first hard question, so he gave the cards to the waterboard woman, the one who had walked away in year 5, whose name was reordered, and who had not spoken about the plant in 2 years. She took the stack and went white and then said one word, which was sequence, because that was the remaining problem, and she saw it instantly. The cards were independent, but the repair was not. The pieces had to be assembled in an order, and the order was the one thing Ilse had left out. They found it 40 minutes later, and Tomas would remember for the rest of his life that it was a 19-year-old kitchen hand who found it, by turning a card over. Every card had a number on the reverse, not the lesson number. A different number in Ilse's handwriting, small in the bottom corner on all 406. Nobody had ever looked, because nobody had ever had a reason to hold more than one card at a time. Ren laid them out by the reverse numbers, and the repair assembled itself in front of them, intake to stacks, exactly the obvious order that a 23-year-old had once argued for in a small office and been told was wrong. Tomas looked at that for a long moment. She had used the wrong order to teach and the right order to execute. And she had kept them apart so that neither could be mistaken for the other, and she had never explained, and she had died without telling a living soul. 52 hours. They ran it as a relay. 406 cards, 388 people, some doing 2. Ren stood at the base of the exchanger tower with the master sequence and called numbers, and people came forward when their number came up, did one thing, performed the check on the back, and reported the result out loud. It was slow. It was slower than anyone had allowed for, because a frightened person doing a thing they do not understand is careful in a way that costs minutes, and by the second morning they were 9 hours behind, and Tomas could see Ren doing the arithmetic and not saying it. And then it began to go wrong, which everyone had known it would. Card 92, a woman from the seed store, ran her thumb around a join and felt a ridge. She said so. The card said, "You are not finished." She did it again and felt the ridge again, and she said so again, and the plant address system said 41 hours, and a queue of 80 people stood behind her on the gantry in absolute silence while she took the seal off and put it back 3 more times. On the 4th attempt, the ridge was gone. She said that too. It cost them 50 minutes. Tomas stood at the rail and watched a woman who had never touched an atmosphere plant in her life refuse to move on until her thumb told her she was right, and he thought, this is the thing. This is what she built, not 400 engineers. 400 people who would each rather stop the whole colony than pretend. At 19 hours, the sequence broke. Card 311 called for a component that was not in the stores, not misplaced, not there, and not there, according to a store's record that had been accurate for 9 years. Ren went through it 4 times. The card described a coupling by a part number that had been superseded 11 years ago, before Ilsa wrote the curriculum, which meant she had specified a part that did not exist even when she was alive. The room, which had held together for 52 hours on the strength of a dead woman's competence, came apart in about 90 seconds. Somebody said out loud what several people were thinking, which was that if she had got this wrong, then they had no way of knowing what else she had got wrong, and that they had been following a corpse's instructions for 2 days on faith. Tomas felt the whole thing tilting. And then reordered, who had walked out in year 5 and had not spoken about the plant in 2 years, said, "No." She said it in a voice that stopped the gantry. She said that Ilsa Brandt did not make part number errors, that she had personally watched the woman reject an entire delivery over a digit, and that if the card said a part that did not exist, then the card meant something else. She turned it over. Under the sequence number, small, in the same hand, see the shelf. Ren went to the stores herself, to the shelf where that superseded coupling would have lived 11 years ago, and found a box with nothing in it but a folded note and a component wrapped in cloth. Ilsa had put it there, undated, waiting. The note said, "If you are looking here, the sequence is running, and you are further along than I expected." It said, "The coupling is a spare I made because the supplier changed the tolerance, and the new one will fail in 11 months. It said, at the bottom, in smaller writing, "I could not train one of you in time. I am sorry. I did what I could think of." Ren came back onto the gantry with the coupling in one hand and the note in the other, and she did not recite it aloud. She gave it to Thomas, and Thomas put it in his pocket, and he has never shown it to anyone, but he confirms it exists. They finished with 4 hours to spare. The last card, number 406, was a boy of 17 from the hydroponics deck whose single instruction was to open a valve 1/4 turn and listen. The whole colony was on the gantries by then, 400 people standing in the cold and the vapor, and the boy put his hand on the valve and looked at Ren, and Ren nodded, and he opened it a 1/4 turn and stood there listening with his head tilted like someone at a door. It hissed for about the length of a slow breath. Then it stopped. And the boy said, in a voice that cracked, that it had stopped, and 400 people on 11 levels of gantry heard a 17-year-old confirm his own check, and the sound they made went up through the tower and did not stop for a long time. Ashgrove still runs the cards. That is the part Thomas Vey thinks people get wrong when they hear the story, because they hear a rescue and he lived through a curriculum. The plant did not get a chief engineer afterwards. It got 406 lessons, held by 406 people, redistributed every year so that no single person accumulates too many, which was Ren's rule and which Thomas thinks Ilsa would have approved of. The exchanger has been serviced 11 times since. Nobody on Ashgrove understands the atmosphere plant. Everybody on Ashgrove can do one thing to it correctly and knows exactly how to tell when they have. Thomas still has the note. He is 51 now and he runs the training, which he finds funny in a way that is difficult to explain to people who did not know her, and the first thing he tells every intake is the thing he was told at 23, which is that they are probably not going to be engineers. Then he tells them the second part, which she never got to say to him, that she had looked at a colony with one expert and 400 people who thought they were nobody, and she had decided the 400 were the resource and had spent 6 years quietly building a machine that could be run by people who did not understand it and would rather stop than lie about a ridge under their thumb. She never told anyone, she just left it on a shelf and died, and trusted that when the hour came, somebody would go looking for what she had been thinking. Somebody did. If you would have turned the card over, stay for the next one.